wind began as a whisper before it transformed into a scream that would tear the soul from the body. It was late November in the year 1703 when the sky above England turned the color of a bruised plum. This was not merely a gale or a tempest, but a breathing and malevolent entity that sought to scour the island clean of life. In the annals of maritime history, there are storms that break ships. And then there is the great storm which broke the spirit of a nation. To this day, the howling of the wind in the chimney carries the voices of the 8,000 souls who were claimed by the dark waters in a single terrifying night. Those who lived through the event did not speak of low-pressure systems or isobars, but of the judgment of God. The preachers in the pulpits of London had warned of a reckoning for the sins of the age, and the people believed that the end of days had finally arrived. It was a time when science and superstition danced an uneasy waltz, and the barometer was a new invention that few understood. When the mercury dropped lower than any man had ever seen, it was interpreted as a sign that the very atmosphere was collapsing. The terror that gripped the population was absolute. As the familiar world began to tear itself apart under the relentless assault of the invisible hand of the wind, the calamity struck the heart of the British Empire at a moment of great vulnerability during the War of the Spanish Succession. The Royal Navy had gathered its mighty fleet in the anchorage known as the Downs, off the coast of Kent. Hundreds of vessels, including great ships of the line, and humble merchant brigs, bobbed on the gray swell. They were waiting for favorable winds to carry them to battle or trade. But instead, they were sitting ducks in a shooting gallery. The sailors on board were hardened men who had faced cannon fire and pirates, but nothing in their experience prepared them for the wall of water and wind that was racing across the Atlantic to meet them. In the days leading up to the apex of the disaster, a strange unease settled over the bustling streets of London. The famous writer Daniel Defoe was in the city, and he noted the peculiar behavior of the birds and the oppressive weight of the air. He would later chronicle the events in his book, simply titled The Storm. But even his eloquent prose struggled to capture the dread. The sky was filled with meteors and strange lightning that made no sound, but illuminated the terrified faces of the citizens. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath before releasing a scream that would shatter windows and topple spires across the entire southern coast of England. Far out to sea on the Eddystone rocks, the eccentric engineer Henry Winstanley sat in his wooden lighthouse. He had built the structure with ornate decorations and boasted that he wished to be inside it during the greatest storm that ever blew. Fate has a cruel sense of irony, and the heavens accepted his challenge with a brutal enthusiasm. As the waves began to crash over the lantern room, Winstanley must have realized that his confidence was misplaced. The wooden tower groaned under the impact of water that hit with the force of solid iron. He was not just facing a storm. He was facing the total erasure of his life work and his own existence. The true fury of the tempest arrived on the night of November 26th with a violence that defies modern comprehension. In London, the sound was deafening as chimney stacks toppled like ninepins, crashing through roofs and crushing those sleeping in their beds. 700 ships were piled up in the Pool of London. The River Thames transformed into a chaotic soup of timber and rigging. The lead roofing on Westminster Abbey was rolled up like a scroll by the sheer force of the gale. People dared not go outside for fear of flying tiles, but staying inside meant risking death by collapsing masonry. The Queen herself was forced to take shelter in a cellar beneath St. James's Palace, while the capital cowered in the dark. The true tragedy was unfolding in the pitch-black churn of the English Channel. The Downs anchorage had turned into a killing field, where the wind stripped the canvas from the masts in seconds. Ships dragged their heavy anchors across the seabed as if they were toys pulled by a petulant child. The darkness was absolute save for the flashes of lightning that revealed mountains of white water towering over the decks. Captains shouted orders that were instantly snatched away by the roar of the gale, leaving crews to operate on instinct and panic. The mighty wooden walls of the Royal Navy were reduced to helpless driftwood. Rear Admiral Beaumont was aboard his flagship, the Mary, a 60-gun vessel of immense power and prestige. He was a seasoned commander, but the forces arrayed against him were beyond the scope of naval tactics. The Mary, along with the Stirling Castle and the Northumberland, were being driven inexorably toward the Goodwin Sands. The Sands are a notorious ship swallower, a shifting mass of sandbanks that become quicksand during storms. To run aground on the Goodwins was a death sentence, and every sailor in the fleet knew the grim reputation of that place. The anchors failed one by one, snapping cables thick as a man is leg with the sound of gunshots. The horror on the decks of the Mary must have been absolute as the ship shuddered and struck the sandbar. The vessel did not just stop, it began to break apart under the relentless pounding of the waves. Men were thrown into the freezing surf, where the sand churned the water into a suffocating slurry. Admiral Beaumont remained on the quarterdeck, maintaining his dignity as the world disintegrated around him. There were no lifeboats that could be launched in such weather, and no hope of rescue from the shore. The pride of the Navy was being ground into splinters by the mortar and pestle of the sea. Nearby, the Stirling Castle suffered a similar fate as it was lifted by a colossal wave and slammed onto the hard sand. The ship was carrying nearly 400 men, and almost all of them were doomed to perish within the hour. The sounds of cracking timber mixed with the cries of the drowning created a symphony of hell that the survivors would never forget. Those who managed to cling to wreckage were flayed by the wind, which was blowing salt spray with such velocity it stripped skin. It was a scene of carnage that rivaled the bloodiest battles of the war. Yet no enemy fired a shot. On the shore, the townspeople of Deal watched helplessly or hid in their homes as the sea consumed the fleet. The roar of the ocean was so loud it shook the foundations of the houses along the coast. Through the gloom, they could see the distress signals of the dying ship's flares that offered brief glimpses of the tragedy. Some locals were paralyzed by fear, while others saw a grim opportunity in the disaster. The legend of the wreckers, those who lure ships to doom or plunder the dead, is woven into this night. But even the greediest looter could not venture out into the teeth of this roaring gale without risking their own life. One man named Thomas Powell stood out as a beacon of humanity. Amidst the overwhelming darkness and indifference, he was a slop seller in Deal, and he was horrified by the refusal of the local customs officers to send help. He used his own money to bribe boatmen to venture out into the subsiding waves to rescue the survivors clinging to the rigging. Powell saved hundreds of lives that day, pulling shivering and half-dead sailors from the grasp of the Goodwins. His heroism highlights the stark contrast between the best and worst of human nature during a crisis. But for thousands of others, there was no Thomas Powell coming to save them. As the dawn broke on the morning of November 27th, the scale of the devastation became visible to the stunned survivors. The coast was littered with the debris of a once proud fleet, and the bodies of the drowned washed up in windrows. The Mary, the Stirling Castle, and the Northumberland were gone erased from the surface of the ocean. Only a few broken masts sticking out of the water marked their graves on the Goodwin Sands. The loss of life was staggering, with estimates ranging from 8,000 to 15,000 seamen dead in a single night. It was a blow that crippled the Royal Navy more effectively than any French armada. Daniel Defoe ventured out into the English countryside to document the aftermath and found a landscape that looked as if it had been shelled. Thousands of ancient oak trees in the New Forest were snapped like twigs or uprooted entirely. Barns were flattened, and livestock lay dead in the fields, their bodies battered by falling debris. The salt spray had been carried 20 miles inland, coating the grass in brine, so that the surviving cattle could not graze. It was a scene of desolation that reinforced the belief that this was a supernatural punishment. The land itself seemed to be in mourning for the violence it had endured, but the most lingering legacy of the great storm is not found in the history books, but in the ghost stories of the coast. The Goodwin Sands have always been a place of high strangeness, but after 1703, the activity intensified. Fishermen working the waters near the sands began to report seeing phantom ships in the fog. These were not generic vessels, but specifically 17th century warships with high stern castles and tattered sails. They would appear silently gliding against the wind before vanishing into the mist. The locals whispered that the fleets of Admiral Beaumont were still trying to maneuver out of the trap. One persistent legend involves the sighting of the Stirling Castle on the anniversary of the storm. Witnesses claim to see the ship fully rigged, struggling against a phantom gale, while the sea around it remains calm. They describe hearing the phantom sounds of a ship in distress, the creaking of wood, and the shouting of orders. It is as if the energy of that traumatic night was so intense that it imprinted itself onto the atmosphere. The event plays out like a recording, trapped in time, replaying the final moments of the doomed crew. These sightings are often accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature and an overwhelming feeling of sorrow. There are also chilling tales of the Lady Louvibond, a schooner said to be wrecked on the sands under cursed circumstances, while the Lady Louvibond is a separate legend. The great storm charged the entire area with a dark energy. The convergence of so much sudden death created a thin veil between the worlds of the living and the dead. Sailors passing the Goodwins at night often report the sensation of being watched from the water. Some have even claimed to see faces bobbing in the waves' pale and wide-eyed, silently screaming for help. These are the spectral remnants of the thousands who were denied a Christian burial. The Eddystone Lighthouse, where Henry Winstanley met his hubris-driven end, was completely wiped from the face of the rock when the storm cleared not a trace of the structure, or the men inside remained save for a single twisted piece of iron. It was as if a giant hand had simply wiped the rock clean, leaving nothing behind. Mariners say that on stormy nights, you can still see a phantom light burning where the lighthouse once stood. They call it Winstanley. Is lantern a ghostly beacon that warns ships to keep their distance? It serves as a grim reminder that nature will always humble those who think they can tame it. In London, the cleanup took years, and the psychological scars took generations to heal. The cost of the damage was in the millions of pounds, a staggering sum for the early 18th century. But it was the stories of the wind that lingered longest in the collective memory of the city. People spoke of hearing voices in the wind for years after the event voices that sounded strangely like drowning sailors. The great storm became a marker in time, a division between the old world and the new. It was the night the devil came to England and shook the foundations of the earth. The phenomenon of ghost ships is not unique to England, but the concentration of sightings around the Goodwins is unparalleled. The shifting sands have swallowed hundreds of ships over the centuries, but the fleet of 1703 remains the most famous. Paranormal investigators suggest that the quartz in the sand may act as a recording medium for the emotional energy. This theory attempts to explain why the sounds and sights of the disaster are replayed with such fidelity. Whether it is geology or theology, the result is a patch of ocean that feels fundamentally wrong. One particularly harrowing account comes from a steamer captain in the early 20th century who strayed too close to the sands. He reported seeing an antique warship bearing down on him in a dense fog. He ordered hard to starboard to avoid a collision, bracing for the impact of the wooden hull. But the warship passed right through his vessel, leaving behind a smell of ozone and rotting kelp. His crew was terrified, and many refused to sail past the Goodwins ever again. They were convinced they had seen the Mary on her eternal patrol of the dead. The story of the Great Storm also serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of human civilization. We build our stone houses and our mighty ships and believe ourselves to be masters of our domain. But all it takes is a shift in the atmosphere, a gathering of wind and water to reduce our works to rubble. The ghosts that haunt the coast are not just spirits of the dead. They are echoes of our own vulnerability. They remind us that we exist at the mercy of forces far older and more powerful than we can comprehend. The roaring gale of 1703 is a memento mori on a planetary scale. Even today, when a heavy storm batters the southern coast of England, the locals will cast nervous glances toward the sea. They know that the sands out there are shifting and revealing the bones of the past. Marine archaeologists occasionally find timber and cannon from the lost fleet, confirming the historical truth. But for the people of Deal and Ramsgate, the truth is not in the artifacts, but in the atmosphere. They know that on certain nights, when the wind howls from the southwest, the past is not dead. It is merely waiting for the right conditions to scream again. The church declared the storm a national calamity, and Queen Anne ordered a day of fasting and repentance. The nation donned sackcloth and ashes, acknowledging their powerlessness before the Almighty. This religious fervor added another layer of psychological weight to the disaster. It cemented the idea that the ghosts of the storm were not just accident victims, but souls trapped in a purgatory of judgment. This theological dread permeates the ghost stories, transforming them from simple scares into moral lessons. To see the ghost ships is to look into the face of divine wrath. Modern science has tried to model the Great Storm using computer simulations and historical data. Meteorologists estimate it was a Category 2 hurricane that somehow maintained its structure across the cold Atlantic. This scientific explanation does nothing to diminish the terror of the experience for those who lived it. Knowing the wind speed was 100 miles per hour does not comfort the man watching his roof fly away. And science cannot explain the persistent reports of spectral lights hovering over the site of the wrecks. The mystery of the supernatural resists the sterile analysis of data and charts. There are whispers among the old mariners that the ghost ships are not merely replaying their doom, but are actively recruiting. Legend says that if you hear the hail of a phantom watchman from the Goodwins, you must not answer. To answer the call of the dead is to invite the sea to claim you as well. It is a superstition born of fear, but rooted in the high number of inexplicable disappearances in the area. The sea is a jealous entity, and it does not like to give up its prizes. The fleet of 1703 belongs to the ocean now and forever. The soundscape of the great storm is perhaps its most terrifying legacy, aside from the visual horrors. Survivors wrote of a shrieking that sounded like 10,000 demons unleashed from the pit of hell. This specific acoustic quality is often reported in paranormal encounters on the coast. It is described as a high-pitched keening that seems to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrates in the chest and causes a primal panic response in anyone unlucky enough to hear it. It is the sonic signature of a tragedy that scarred the ether. As we look back at the great storm of 1703, we must acknowledge the thin line between history and horror. The event was a historical fact documented by the government and witnesses like Defoe, but the sheer magnitude of the suffering pushed the event into the realm of the supernatural. When pain and fear are concentrated to such a degree, they leave a stain on the location that time cannot wash away. The ghost ships in the roaring gale are the permanent residents of this stain. They sail a sea that no longer exists in a time that will not end. The final resting place of Admiral Beaumont and his men is a shifting grave that refuses to stay still. The Goodwin Sands are constantly moving, revealing and concealing the wreckage in a slow, rhythmic cycle. This geological restlessness mirrors the spiritual restlessness of the ghosts. They cannot find peace because their grave is never settled. They are in a constant state of flux, trapped between the solid earth and the fluid ocean. It is a fitting purgatory for men who died in the chaos of the greatest storm on record. So if you ever find yourself on the coast of Kent on a blustery night in late November, listen closely. Ignore the sound of the traffic and the noise of the modern world. Listen to the wind as it whips over the gray waves of the channel. You might hear the faint tolling of a ship bell or the desperate cry of a man fighting for his life. And if you look out to the horizon, you might see a flicker of light where no ship should be. It is the ghost fleet of the great storm sailing on the winds of eternity, forever bound to the roaring gale.